From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Library of Congress. I'm John Cole. I'm the director of the Center for the Book, and I'm very pleased to have such a wonderful audience here for quite a special occasion. For those of you who don't know about the Center, let me just say briefly that it is the reading promotion arm of the Library of Congress, and we promote books and reading and libraries and literature not only here in Washington, but also around the country through a network of state centers for the book and a network of national reading promotion partners, many of which are represented here today. The Center for the Book also is involved in developing the programming, the author programming for the National Book Festival and the Pavilion of the States, where we are able to bring representatives from all of the states to show off and give away materials relating to what they're doing in the states to promote books and reading. In that giveaway spirit, we're starting a new tradition here at Center for the Book events, and as you go out, you will see stacks of several titles from the Center for the Book storage inventory, which we are giving away. We started this tradition at the National Book Festival. We seem to be changing warehouses here at the Library of Congress, and the Center for the Book has been lucky enough to have a lot of authors and have a lot of publications. Around 500 boxes of publications are in the warehouse. And so we're looking at them again and going to do our best at every event to pick appropriate titles. Now this brings out the librarian in me, right? I can select for my audience, but you'll find some interesting titles there as you go out. Today you will hear a little bit, I hope, in our conversations between Leonard and John about The Exquisite Corpse, which is a new feature on a Center for the Book website, read.gov, in which John himself has contributed the first chapter, challenging other famous children's authors to follow in his footsteps as they dare, in terms of keeping this story alive for the next year with new chapters coming out. I believe it's every other week. There's some promotional material in the back about The Exquisite Corpse, as well as a schedule of forthcoming Center for the Book talks and events. We're going to conclude today with a question and answer session, and I know there'll be questions of both of our speakers. They're both remarkable writers and excellent speakers as well. We are going to be filming this for later viewing on the Library of Congress and the Center for the Book's website, where you now can see actually around 150 such talks if you go to our website. And I just want you to know that if you ask questions, you may become part of our broadcast, and you have already given us your permission if you ask that question. I'd like to start by introducing Leonard and also saying a few words about John and his role as the National Ambassador for Young People's Literature. First, we are very fortunate to have Leonard Marcus back here for a second program at the Center for the Book. His first program involved his wonderful History of Children's Literature, Minders of Make-Believe, Idealists, Entrepreneurs, and the Shaping of American Children's Literature, which was a book that was published in 2008 and is the culmination, not the culmination, a major step in Leonard's continuing documentation and reflections on American children's literature. Leonard is really the foremost historian of children's literature that we have in this country, and is continuing to make very creative contributions to the field. And actually, Leonard told me about the new book when he was here before, and I said, wow, what a good idea, what a wonderful contribution this will be. And I don't know what other books Leonard has cooking up, but maybe someone could ask him that question so we can learn together. Leonard's previous books, I'm going to read just a little bit of what we put in the press release. Leonard Marcus began his publishing career with a widely acclaimed biography of Goodnight Moon author Margaret Wise Brown, called Awakened by the Moon. He also has written Oscar, The Big Adventure of a Little Sock Monkey, which he created with his wife, Amy Schwartz. Then in 2009, Houghton Mifflin published the book I just described. But Leonard, you're going to need to help me now. The little book you gave me once, which was The Walking Tour of New York City. Storied City is a wonderful paperback. Is it still in print?
It's coming back in the expanded
See
edition.
what I tell you, new project at every moment, every turn. And it's a wonderful little walking tour of New York City and the well-known book sites and all of the things that book people really like to see when they tour. And I'm glad to hear that it's coming back. Leonard has included John in as one of the, I think, 13 funny people in his book, and he will be talking with John about John's, not only his career, but also his thoughts about writing. But I want to say just a word about how lucky we were at the Library of Congress in partnership with the Children's Book Council to have John be able to serve as our first national ambassador for young people's literature. This was a new position which has been created. The national ambassador is named by the Librarian of Congress. It's a project for a 2-year period with co-sponsorship of the CBC and the Center for the Book, whereas support is provided for the ambassador to be an ambassador for young people's literature, for certain at the National Book Festival, as you can imagine, and also for certain for Children's Book Week. And with the new leadership at the CBC, Children's Book Week has been moved from the fall to May, and the Center for the Book is able to now become more of a partner in that endeavor as well. One quick story: at the American Library Association midwinter meeting, right after, it must have been 2 years ago, we had just announced that John was the ambassador, an event that took place at a branch library. We announced it at a branch library in a cold January day, a branch library of New York Public Library. And we will be announcing the new one, which I will address in a moment, not the name, but the situation, in January here. But at any rate, we had a wonderful drawing, and so people could just put their business cards in, and the winner would get John Scieszka to come to that library for a reading promotion event. And in the end, we had a wonderful winner from South Carolina, right, John? Yes, I want to get these right. And she was a retired children's librarian who really took on this project with great enthusiasm and hooked it up with a public library. It was it Spartan? Do you remember? City Festival. And so we built it into an existing event in South Carolina, but added the young reader component and the national ambassador component. And it turned out to be a wonderful, wonderful kind of event that strengthened what was already there, but then provided the basis for introducing this new element and this new program in the nation. Suffice it to say that John has done yeoman's work in visiting around the country, at appearing at established events, but also in appearing in special events and that produced by individual libraries. And we are very grateful for his enthusiasm and also his productivity. Who would have known we would have an author who would have at least 3 new books come out, at least 3, 4 or 5, during the 2 years, which also meant we could not spend all of the national ambassador's budget on John's travel. The publishers paid for the tours, and then we would just go around and hook in little national ambassador events. So it was great. I'll conclude just by saying that the other exciting part of what we are all a part of today is we're meeting the very week that the Library of Congress's first Young Readers Center will be opening. It is a project of the Center for the Book with support from both the librarian's office and library services. Our erstwhile staff is here. Jane Gilchrist. Jane, just stand up to, oh, I know. She's going to be heading it. And Jane, and we've been dying to open this. The truth is, it's really been pretty much ready since July, but we are the Library of Congress, and we want Congress to be part of the opening. And on Friday, the congresswoman behind this, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, is going to be coming to open it with her 3 children, reading to them and maybe reading to other kids on Friday afternoon here. And we will be off and running. And we are going to take a trek over to see the center after the signing today. And those of you who would like to at least see it, there's no event there, but would want to see it, are welcome to follow us over. That long introduction aside, I'm happy to turn this over to Leonard Marcus, our guest author and book and writer. Okay.
Oh, well, good afternoon, and thank you so much, John, for having me here. And thank you, John Scieszka, for being here, too. This book of mine, Funny Business, takes a look at some of the writers for young people who know how to make them and us laugh. And I think the reason that I was so keen on doing this is that when I was very young and was just beginning to learn to read, and it might surprise you to know having a very hard time doing it, the writer who sort of caught my interest and opened the door for me as a reading person was Dr. Seuss. Now, we didn't have his books at home, but my pediatrician had his books in his waiting room. And I was a somewhat sickly child, and so I spent a great deal of time in that waiting room. And for a while, in fact, I thought I was getting my polio booster shots from Dr. Seuss. I wasn't sure that there were 2 doctors or just one. But then what happened was, in school, when it was found that I was in the slow group of readers, we were the, I think, chimney sparrows, as opposed to the tigers and the cougars and whatever. I would spend an hour each week with a what was then called a remedial reading teacher, and the funny thing was, or the odd thing was, that I was extremely verbal. I just couldn't learn to read. And so she, knowing that, said to me, well, why don't you write something? Why don't you write a little poem? And she was aware that I was interested in Dr. Seuss. So I began to write these funny little verses, which I would then bring into her to read the following week. And because I had written them myself, I had no trouble reading them. And that was the first experience I had of success as a reader. And it became linked in my mind forever with writing. And so to me, reading and writing are really pretty much aspects of the same process and the same enjoyable act. Since then, I've become very interested in biography in general and in the lives of writers in particular, and have written a number of books, one taking the form of a literary biography, which John mentioned, another in the form of the letters of an editor to all of her authors and illustrators, Ursula Nordstrom, the great editor at Harper who discovered Maurice Sendak, among others. And also I've done quite a few interviews. And interviews are kind of an interesting exploratory form of conversation where you hope to make contact or have an encounter with another mind. And at best, to have them begin to think about things in ways that are new to them as well as to you as the listener. And I thought I would read you a few of my favorite little bits and pieces from Funny Business, because one thing that you find about writers is that they sort of can't help being themselves. And even a passing anecdote or comment is very apt to be characteristic of the way they write and think about the world. Before I do that, I just wanted to mention that I became very interested in the sort of esoteric subject of theories of comedy. It's very easy to sort of kill the butterfly with comedy, and that's, of course, the last thing you want to do. But it is interesting to know, which I learned from a Russian poet for children, Kornei Tchaikovsky, in a book called From 2 to 5, which refers to those ages, those early formative ages of a child's life. How early comedy becomes a part of our lives. Tchaikovsky recalled being in his study one morning, and his little girl, who was then about 18 months old, appeared at his feet and pointed to the cat who was on the rug and said, "Doggy." So for her, having mastered the first, bits of knowledge about the world, she was now ready to start flipping things. And for her, it was amusing to do that. It was playing with reality. And it was also giving a gift to her father. I think that that's really the beginning of humor in all of us. That feeling of having just enough mastery or control over the world that we can start to play with it. And then it goes from there. Here's Judy Blume not being able to help being Judy Blume. I was curious about how she felt when her first books were published. And I asked her if she would go into bookstores to see if they were there. And she admitted that she still does that. And here is something that happened to her on one of those occasions. Here it is. This was just after Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret was published, which was her breakthrough book, and of course, one of her most controversial books. I remember finding Margaret shelved with the Bibles. That was funny. I said to the woman in the store, "That book doesn't belong with the Bibles." She said, "Yes, it does." I said, "No, I don't think so." She said, "Well, listen to this," and read to me from the jacket copy. But she read it wrong. She said, "Margaret Simon, 12 Chats with God." Of course, what it did say was, Margaret Simon, 12 Chats with God. You see, she said, that is why this book certainly does belong with the Bibles. There was nothing I could do to convince her otherwise. When I decided to do this book about comedy, I thought, how am I going to get people to talk about how to be funny? Because the minute you ask somebody that, most people, not everyone, and John happens to be one of the exceptions. I'm not putting you on the spot. But most writers or comedians have a hard time explaining what they do. They do it on a pretty much instinctual basis. But then I realized that I didn't really have to ask that question. I could just let them talk, and the humor would come out, as it did with Judy Blume. Now here, I had the great privilege to interview Beverly Cleary, who was, I think, in her late 80s when I met her. And she's very reserved and very quiet, and I think she appreciated the fact that I'd read a lot of her books and done my homework, because she's a consummate craftsperson. And so she opened up with me a little bit. And this is a story that she told. As you can imagine, as someone who'd been publishing very popular books since 1950, she gets a lot of mail from readers. In fact, she wrote that book, Dear Mr. Henshaw, which won the Newbery Medal so many years after the start of her career, in a way as a message to her readers, an all too subtle message, it turned out, to stop writing to her. Because the author in Mr. Henshaw really doesn't appreciate getting bombarded with letters, and he takes several occasions during the course of that book to let the children who might be reading the book know that. But be that as it may, she did receive this letter, which she described for me. I once received an unusual letter from a class that had a child-sized stuffed doll that the children shipped in a plastic container the size of a garbage can to different well-known people. The doll was supposed to spend a day with the recipient, who was to return it with a letter describing the day. The object of the project was to teach the children that they could achieve their goals. Well, I was so overwhelmed with work and family at that point, there was no way I was going to invite a large doll in a garbage can into my house. I wrote saying I was sorry I couldn't invite the doll. I have forgotten its name to visit. But I thought there was a lesson to be learned. If the doll couldn't visit me, it could change its direction and choose somebody else. I hope this was not a negative message. She's, as you can tell, has this very deadpan wit, and you'd almost not realize she was trying to be funny, but it always comes through. Daniel Handler is the author of the Lemony Snicket books, and if you've ever taken a look at one of those, you can well imagine that even as a small child, he had an unusually large vocabulary. He was actually also one of the very thoughtful, reflective people that I spoke with, and has a very keen sense of why he does what he does. And it might be surprising that his father was a Holocaust survivor, and he attributes some of the particular flavor of his humor, which is rooted in chance, really. The chance collision of verbal meanings in puns, but also in the sort of melodramatic kind of story where things happen in unlikely sequences, resulting in almost operatic outcomes. That in part comes out of his sense from early on, from hearing his father's stories, that nothing is really given in life, and that you never know what's going to happen. And then to be able to write about that in a way that has a comic aspect to it is a great thing, I think, for children. Well, here he is talking a little bit about all the words that he knew as a child. And also, it will also not be that surprising that even then he had a tuxedo, about which you will also hear. This is him talking, the primary advantage of a large vocabulary when you're young is entirely different from the primary advantage of a large vocabulary when you're an adult. When you're an adult, it's so you can describe things with precision. And when you're a child, it's mostly so that you can insult people without their knowing it, or otherwise baffle them. A child with a large vocabulary is a trusted child. The idea is that a bookworm is not the kind of child who would ever get into any trouble. If, however, you are the kind of bookworm that I was, and you were reading Confessions of an Opium Eater, you are probably somewhat likelier to get into trouble than a child who knows fewer words. And he says, I learned at an early age that formality is a very powerful weapon. I think this is really true, and it's something that some children do realize. Daniel Handler is all about outwitting the world. And even as a child, he understood that that could be a way of looking at things. I went through a very long necktie phase in early high school. In high school, I had a job playing cocktail piano. I could play well enough to fake my way through a bunch of show tunes. I would play at private parties and fashion shows. It was a wonderful job for a young man because it paid well and it was easy. One of the side benefits was that it meant that I owned a tuxedo. I found that I could go anywhere in a tuxedo unquestioned, as opposed to in regular teenage garb, in which you can scarcely go anywhere. So my friends and I would get all dressed up and go to one of the hotels, this was in San Francisco, that had a penthouse restaurant. We would stop at the penultimate floor, get out, and hang out on the fire escape, where there was a great view of the city. Ordinarily, no one in their right minds would have let teenagers through the lobby of a hotel and into an elevator that led to a bar to which they were not allowed to go. But because we were dressed up, it threw them off, and by the time they thought, wait a minute, it was too late. And here, in a very different vein, is something from Christopher Paul Curtis, a writer who now lives in Canada, but who grew up in Flint, Michigan. He's African American, and he, like his father, spent many years working in the Fisher auto body plant on the assembly line, which was sort of what people tended to do growing up in that town. At least many people did. And he did that for 13 years. And he began, in a small way, writing just to sort of save his sanity while he was in the factory. And I asked him what he wrote, and he would say he kept a journal, and he would write things like, I hope my boss dies. And then he added, still it was writing. But this is the part that I wanted to read because, when you're interviewing somebody, it's kind of interesting to think about what might be the moments from their past that really had the most meaning for them. And I thought maybe one of those moments for him would be the day that he walked out of the factory for the last time. So I asked him about that, and here's what he said. Did he remember it? Oh, yes. It was a big moment for me. I was giddy, but it was also very frightening. There was just one industry in Flint, and you had the feeling that if you left that industry, you would fall off the edge of the earth. There were guys who had left, and you'd see them occasionally, and they always looked so unhappy. To get to and from the factory, you had to cross a busy street where every once in a while someone would get hit by a passing car. I remember thinking, if I get hit on my last day, please let it be going into the factory, not going out. Because I couldn't think of anything worse than to have spent my last 8 hours on Earth in that factory. I can remember being really careful crossing the street that last time. So, let's see. I'll just read you one more, because I had the pleasure years ago of meeting Iona Opie, who with her husband Peter Opie, over in England, wrote the Oxford Book of English Nursery Rhymes, and then a whole series of amazing books about children and their games, their playground games, and the rhymes that go with them. They were really the great anthropologists of modern childhood. And Iona Opie, when I met her, also to interview her for another book, was totally different from what I had expected. I thought, well, here's this venerable scholar. She's going to be very reserved and intimidating. But nothing could have been farther from the truth. She was the most down-to-earth person. And she also approached the material that she wrote about in a very down-to-earth way. She liked to talk about the uses of nonsense. And I thought, what could that possibly be? But actually, that is how she thought about it. Nonsense has grabbed a hold of our imaginations as a people, not because it's clever or it doesn't mean anything, but on the contrary, because it has some place in our lives. And I think that can be said about humor in general. And so here is Carl Hiaasen, who you may know as the writer of adult sort of comic murder mysteries, all set in Florida. But here he is talking about how comedy served a very good purpose for him when he was growing up. And I should add, as background, that he skipped a year very early on in his schooling, so he was always shorter than everybody else around him. In elementary school, I lived close enough that I could walk or ride my bicycle to school. But starting with 7th grade, they piled us into a bus to take us to the naval station where our new school was. It was a long bus ride, believe me, especially if someone was hassling you who outweighed you by 2 to 1. We had kids riding that bus who had been held back so many times they were probably 19 or 20 years old. They had full beards. I wasn't quite stupid enough to take a swing at a kid like that. If they wanted to trip me when I was going down the aisle to my seat, they were absolutely free to do so, as far as I was concerned. And he would very often make a joke about himself in the hope that it would deflect the attention of the bully toward the next guy down the aisle. So humor really was a self-preservative for him. And as I thought about all the things that the various people I spoke with said, it seemed like each one of them had some really good and practical reason for why humor meant so much to them. So now this might seem like a good time, a good moment to invite John Scieszka to join us. All right. Yeah.
Thanks, Leonard.
Yeah. Okay. The ambassadorial chariot, I understand, is double parked outside.
Yes, it is.
So we'll try to make this quick.
Oh no, take your time. I got the helicopter on the roof too.
So, my first question for you, John, is why did the boxer go to the library?
Wow. I don't know. I was frantically trying to remember what exactly I had told Leonard about humor before this. I don't know. Why did he want to go to the library?
He wanted to hit the books.
Wow.
Okay, that's all right.
Wait, I'll tell you another good one I heard from a 4-year-old the other day.
Yeah.
What's brown and sticky?
What?
A stick.
All right. Okay.
Is that the best 4-year-old
That's
joke
pretty good.
ever?
Yeah.
You looked a little worried there.
Humor is worrisome. Yeah. So the other thing, the next thing I wanted to ask you about was something that E.B. White said many years ago. He said, here's the quote, "The world likes humor, nobody doubts that, but it decorates its serious artists with laurel and its wags with Brussels sprouts."
Yeah.
And so my question is, why do you think it is that humor doesn't always get the respect it deserves?
That's a spectacular question. And actually, that's what I really loved about what Leonard did with this book, was just try to elevate funny a little bit in the minds of the public. And the same to the Librarian of Congress, actually, who, when they called me to ask if I wanted to be the ambassador, I actually did tell them, I said, I think you misdialed Catherine Patterson's number. Like, don't you want the lady who makes us all cry?
Yeah.
Because that is absolutely the truth. It's like humor always gets
That could be
short
her
shrift.
epithet from now on.
I think it could be. But you know what? And I'm, like Leonard, a real fan and student of humor, and kind of picking that apart. And it seems to go way back to the Greeks, and with the distinction between tragedy and comedy. And it was always seen as kind of a lesser and baser form. But I don't buy that, because I grew up in that same era as you, reading Dr. Seuss and Mad Magazine, which got me in a lot of trouble in Catholic school, because that was an instrument of Satan, which only made me want to read it more, and Rocky and Bullwinkle. And so in my mind, all that stuff mixed together, and what I was reading in Mad Magazine somehow seemed to me so much more real than a lot of the stuff I was reading in school.
Yeah, and humor often is tied up with the forbidden, isn't it, in one way or another?
And exposing sort of like the tyranny of just, I don't know, random authority.
Yeah.
And it's a way to get back at that. And what better random authority than, well, we shouldn't get into that because this is being taped, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, I mean, especially since we're in Washington, after Walter Cronkite died, people looked around and they found that the most trusted man in America today is Jon Stewart.
Yeah.
And I think that's really pretty fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, that's incredibly fascinating. And who could have imagined that, like when I was going to school? Because honestly, we couldn't read comic books. And even when I was younger, we were learning to read with Dick and Jane. That just seemed crazy to me. Like, there was no humor in there. The humor was like, look at the dog. Like, ha, ha, ha. It's just like, wow.
Huh.
I was looking for Jon Stewart even back then.
Yeah. So, John, what place did comedy have in your household when you were growing up? Or was there none? Did you?
Yeah,
did you
that
sort of
was
discover
actually
that on your
another
own?
place. It
Yeah.
was defensive.
Yeah.
Because I grew up with 5 brothers, and I'm the second oldest one, and as most people know, the nicest one. I love to tell kids that, and they look at me and they just go, oh, yeah. But it was this great defensive mechanism where my older brother, Jim, had a big vocabulary and could talk really fast.
And he became a lawyer.
Yes, exactly. And he impressed all the adults just by talking a lot. And he could get away with things by arguing. And I could get away with things in a Carl Hiaasen way by actually making a joke out of it. Or deflecting the attention long enough so I could grab the piece of chicken. And then leave brothers 4, 5, and 6 still laughing.
Yeah.
So it was really kind of essential in our family.
Oh, yeah. Here's something that Sharon Creech said, another one of the people that I interviewed. I asked her if she could remember the first time that she'd ever tried to make somebody laugh. And she could. And she said, when I was about 8 years old and my parents were shouting at each other, I put on an outrageous outfit, my father's shoes, my mother's dress, and a wig, in an effort to make them stop arguing. Somehow I understood that humor might work. It did. Isn't that something? Yeah.
I never did that. If that's where you were going with that.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
That's kind of cool, though.
Yeah. Well, and another person who talked a little bit about this kind of thing, how humor could be so important, was Dick Kingsmith, who was British. He wrote Babe. That's the book that he's best known for. He's written about 100 books, though. And he was a foot soldier in World War II and saw some really terrible things in Italy with his fellow soldiers. And he said, they would joke with each other, and that was, for them, just the way to keep going.
And that's what happened in Catholic school. It was kind of similar to being in the trenches.
Yeah.
And actually, then I did go from Catholic school to a military academy. And interestingly, I grew up in Flint, Michigan also, where Christopher Paul Curtis was from. And though my parents didn't have anything to do with the auto industry, kind of weirdly enough, it was a kind of a dismal place, which is why I ended up going to Indiana to a military academy. And that seemed like a step up. And really it was, because I got my own bed. We got lots of food.
You got to march?
Yeah, I didn't know about that part. I should have done a little more investigation. Found out, and turns out we marched to every meal. Like breakfast. We got up and got wool pants on and marched to breakfast. I didn't know that until I got there. I should have asked a lot more.
Well, it seems to me that one reason that comedy might not be highly valued is that people think it's easy.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you'd talk a little bit about comic timing and sort of some of what goes into making something funny.
Yeah, that's absolutely a piece of it too. It's where if you have a really good piece of comedy, it should seem effortless. And if it seems like it's too labored over, then it's not really that funny. So that, I think, gives people the illusion like, oh, that's easy. It's just funny. But I love going to schools and showing kids like all the different drafts for, say, even the book like The Stinky Cheese Man, which I wrote and rewrote for the better part of an entire year. And then just took it around and kept changing it as I read it to kids and really edited it. And in fact, one of my favorite stories was about, I think it was Samuel Clemens. No, it was E.B. White, who had left a piece that he was working on his desk. And his wife read it one time, and she said, "This is awful. This is not funny at all." And he said, "No, because it's only like the 4th draft." He had like 5 more to go before it would actually be fun. And that's absolutely the truth of comedy.
Yeah.
And visual humor, too, because I was lucky enough to be working with Lane Smith as an artist where we collaborated very closely and really traded jokes back and forth. And then with our designer also in that book, say like the joke where the type gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Originally, that was my joke. I thought it'd be funny if the type just fell off the page. But Molly said, no, it'd be funnier if it gets smaller. And it is. So I thought, hey. And in fact, and this is her joke on the back of the book, too, where originally she was just designing it and didn't know what the little red hen was going to say on the back. So she just filled in the whole page with blah, blah, blah. And Lane and I saw that and we said, that's hilarious. Let's keep that. And also, I wouldn't have to write anything. So. Laziness is a big factor in comedy also. I don't know if we covered that.
So I've got another quote. This is also from Daniel Handler, and it's him observing his own son when he was about, I think, 2.5 years old. And he was starting to see his son's sense of humor emerge. Let's see if I can just find that.
Oh, is this him?
Do you see it? Oh, yeah. Thank you. His son's name is Otto, 3.5.
He's hysterical, by the way.
You've met him? I'm not surprised. So he says, Otto loves to sing songs that he already knows and make all the words start with the same letter. Boob bar by Bunshine, by Bonely Bunshine. He can only do that for a line or so before he collapses with laughter. Even at a very early age, this is maybe going back to when he was a toddler, my wife and I would put him to sleep and we'd be having dinner, the monitor would come on, and we would hear him laughing by himself. Even when he had no words whatsoever, he already was finding the world hilarious. So, granted, he wasn't growing up in an ordinary household.
No, but there's definitely something to that. And I think people who enjoy reading and writing comedy do just like entertain themselves no end. Because I'll be in my office just laughing at stuff. And in fact, I'm working on a new book. It's an entire series about aliens who come to take over the world, but they're kind of stupid. So they end up taking over 5th grade.
They decide to start small.
Yeah. Well, they're a little. They've learned everything they know from watching television, and this is my chance just to goof on everything in the world. So one alien becomes a 5th grade boy, one alien becomes a 5th grade girl, and the most clueless one of them all becomes who he thinks will be the most powerful Earthling, and 5th graders usually start just shouting out like, "Principal, teacher." I said, "No, the 5th grade class hamster." And I think I've written probably one of my best chapters ever for anything, in that the hamster actually doesn't speak English too often. And in fact, they defer to him to explain the whole mission. And they say like, "Well, here, Fluffy will explain it." And chapter 5 is entirely in hamster eeks. And I've spent the last 2 weeks like going around to these groups, and there'll be like 250 5th graders, and I'm reading to them, "Eek, eek, 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 eek," said Fluffy. "Eek, eek, eek." And it's like an Andy Kaufman moment where you can go on for 10 minutes, and it just gets better and better. But that's kind of what we strive for in comedy. Now, and that looks easy. You think that's easy? Took me a long time to come up with it.
I bet the first few weeks were the hardest, though.
Yeah. He also speaks dog. So in the second book, guess what there's going to be? An entire chapter of woof, 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 woof. I got a bunch of chapters written already. He says.
I'll be reviewing that book in the morning. So we've already heard Kornei Tchaikovsky's 18-month-old little girl making probably the first joke of her life, and then Daniel Handler's 3.5-year-old boy getting a little more verbally sophisticated and playing with song lyrics that he's already memorized. So I was wondering if you'd talk a little bit about some of the other kinds of comedy that you see in older kids, as thinking of some of the kids that you've worked with as a teacher.
Yeah. Well, a lot of the early stuff that I did came out of my experience teaching 1st grade through 8th grade. And it's really amazing how different that level of comedy is. Where the early guys, it's almost like pure nonsense. And it's that call the cat a dog. That's hilarious. And I think that's incredibly funny. Or a brown and sticky. What's more brown and sticky than a stick? But what I loved just naturally was parody and satire. And I think teaching 2nd and 3rd grade, that's where that happens, or it doesn't. And it's also why I think some people, reviewers included, don't really get humor. And there is no consensus for humor. And why humor isn't often awarded those awards, like a Caldecott Medal or an Academy Award. It just first seems too easy. And honestly, for a committee, I think it's too hard to agree upon. Where like 4 people will say like, "That is the funniest thing ever." 2 of those other people will say like, "I didn't really get it, and I'm offended." And then the last 2 people will just hate it and say it's bad because they didn't get it.
Yeah. Well, something to be really funny, don't you have to risk either being ridiculous or offensive?
Yeah. And in fact, you really have to tread that line, which I learned early on, telling some of those jokes that I heard in the schoolyard at the dining room table. Though my mom was a nurse and she had a whole slew of bad jokes, which actually made it in the book, which is kind of phenomenal. The proctologist joke.
Oh, yes, right.
Which I couldn't actually use that in my memoir, Knucklehead. We won't put that on tape, though. You'll have to read the book.
The proctologist joke.
But it's interesting to see that variety for kids, because recently I've been writing for younger kids with a series of the books for Trucktown, meant exactly for kindergarten and pre-kindergarten readers. So I actually went and hung out with the 3 and 4-year-olds for a while, just to remember like how their brains work. And they're crazy. They're insane. In fact, I think that's where I realized they're like Alzheimer's patients on acid. Because everything is so brand new and so vivid. And it's just like, "Oh my God, look, we're going to get in line." And then like, 3 minutes later, they've forgotten all of that. They
Yeah.
don't even know about
Yeah.
it.
Well, I was going to ask you where you were able to find the humor in trucks.
Just that they are trucks is kind of funny. I mean, and it's that elemental.
Uh-huh.
Like when I was introduced to this class, the teacher was saying like, "Oh, here's John Scieszka who wrote all these books," and the kids were like, one little guy raised his hand, and the teacher called him. He said, can he help me roll out my snakes out of clay?" I went, "Yeah, I can do that." He didn't care who I was. Like, I could have been anybody. I helped him make his snakes out of clay.
Huh.
So they're that concrete and that literal. But, I think I finally figured out how to sneak a little satire and parody. The last book is truckery rhymes. So it's all nursery rhymes. And I love the Opies, by the way. That's one of my favorite books. But turned into truck rhymes. And I found the only way you can do that with kids, because I read them straight, like, eeny, meeny, miny, mo, if you see Big Rig, you should go. And he's this big 18-wheeler, because he will chase you, don't be slow, eeny, meeny, miny, go. But if I just read it to him, I would usually get like half the kids going like, that doesn't sound right. Or some of the little girls would just say like, no, that's wrong. That's just wrong. So first I would let them actually say the rhyme that they knew.
Yeah.
Or like Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. One of the most surreal things was to have like 250 kindergartners all singing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star together. But in Trucktown Nursery Rhymes, it becomes, instead of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, it's Rumble, Rumble, Monster Max, way above the junkyard stacks. And he's the monster truck. So that's just the very beginning of like parody and satire, which I actually heard the best review of from a second grader of mine who said it's actually harder than the thing itself. How the kid described it, he said, because you have to have two things in your brain, he said. And I went, wow. I'm going to put that on the back of all my stuff. You got to have two things in your brain. It's like the real thing and then this new thing, and it becomes this third thing.
So do you think there's boy humor and girl humor?
The short answer is probably yeah. I mean, in my experience being a male teacher in the 90% female-dominated elementary school world, I was the only guy saying like, yeah, let's read Captain Underpants. I think that would be funny. Or the kids would say to me like, we didn't read these books in Miss Alberti's class last year. Because in my class, we read Dr. Seuss, James Marshall's stuff, Roald Dahl. And a lot of the teachers, like the other teachers, didn't think that was really funny.
Yeah.
I said, no, but I like those books. Which was kind of cool that kids got to see all different kinds of stuff.
Oh, yeah. And when Pippi Longstocking was new in the 50s in Sweden, which is where it came from, of course, Pippi Longstocking never goes to school. She doesn't feel like she should go to school. And she doesn't have parents around to tell her otherwise. Of course, the teachers of Sweden were up in arms. They thought this is a very dangerous book. But then they noticed that all of their kids were reading it. And they were wise enough to change their own minds and to say, well, if it's making them read, then maybe it is a good book.
Yeah, and I think there's something that we have to be careful not to stereotype kids too much and just do like all boy humor or all girl humor. I think as writers, we just write out of our experience. And my experience could not have been any more guy-like. I mean, that's why I love the recent Wild Things movie. It's just like the climax of that movie is a dirt clod war. I mean, that's exactly what we did as kids. But it's so nice to see stuff like Diary of a Wimpy Kid out now, which boys, girls, everybody just reading like mad, which is so funny. And he's in there making fun of reading too. Like early on in this book, his mom starts a reading is fun club. And all his friends come over with their books that they love, like Sudoku Insanity, or the Pop-Up Book of Sharks, or the best video game cheats. And she says, no, I think we'll start with the classics. And the next page you see like Little House on the Prairie, Old Yeller. Charlotte's Web is in there. And Greg, the narrator, says like, I just know someone's gonna die in that book. Says it's either the girl or the spider or somebody on the cover is gonna die.
Yeah, so it's that kind of
And
book
he's
for
right.
sure. Yeah. So I did want to ask you about something that Mark Twain said, which is that the secret source of all comedy is sorrow. And do you think there's anything to that?
Some of it, some comedy, but not all of it. Because I think mine honestly comes out of goofing around.
Yeah.
Just like
It certainly
messing
seems that
around
way.
with stuff. Absolutely. Because, yeah, it is. It comes out of that growing up in just like a crazy giant family of all boys. I can't even imagine that my parents actually raised us all. Maybe, I don't think they did. Maybe we just fed and watered ourselves at some point. But maybe there's a little bit of that in that, like, I think I always responded to being told what to do all the time. There's nothing like Catholic school and then a military academy.
Yeah.
I don't know. I should have gone into the Marines afterward.
For the trifecta.
Yeah, I think so. Exactly. and humor was the way to sort of like have your own way underneath all of that stuff or against that stuff. I think you do need something to sort of push off against.
Yeah. So I think the last thing I want to ask you before we have questions from everyone else is, it seems to me that funny books are one of the best kinds of books to get kids interested in reading. And I was wondering if you've had some experience with that through your Guys Read website or in your travels.
Oh, yeah. In fact, that was one of the reasons I actually started this literacy group called Guys Read. And it's a web-based literacy initiative just to get boys reading. Because I found like that boy style of humor, which can be kind of gross and disgusting, not really appreciated in the school world. And it went even further than that. Like it was books that boys love, like nonfiction, books about sharks, comic books, science fiction. All that stuff is kind of like off to the side of real reading.
Yeah.
I mean, teachers always see that as like, that's okay, but it's not real reading.
Yeah. Well, there's the whole sort of tyranny of genre literature and things getting sort of sidetracked and sidelined.
But I definitely see that changing now, and I see kids that you can just, and it's all about finding that book. I think like your Dr. Seuss books. It's that one book that can speak to a kid, and even if he is a fourth grader and he likes like a Lemony Snicket book or Diary of a Wimpy Kid, if that's the book that connects him, I think that's what we need to do.
Yeah, no, I think more and more teachers and librarians are recognizing that.
Yeah,
So
they've been real champions of that.
It's a really good time as far as that goes. There's a lot more flexible thinking. Would anybody like to ask a question or make a comment for either of us?
I think John scared everybody.
Yes. Yeah, sure.
Is it helped you whittle down all the funny men and women children's literature to, and is Daniel Deepwater in the book?
In a manner of speaking.
That's actually funny in itself.
Yeah. He was going to be interviewed, and then he changed his mind at the last minute and wrote this sort of, some would say, snotty message to me, which my editor thought was so funny that she said, "Why don't we publish it?" So it's in the book.
That's the whole Pinkwater chapter. It's like one snotty email.
Yeah. But, yeah, you know.
Oh, we can't say snotty on camera. Say something else, Leonard. Too late.
Too late, yeah. So it's too bad. I would have liked to talk to him, but he just didn't want to do it. So.
Oh, yeah, but how did you whittle it down to like those people?
Well, some of them are just writers that I've read and loved for a long time. Like the chance to talk with Beverly Cleary was just irresistible. And Norton Juster, the author of The Phantom Tollbooth. And as a matter of fact, I mean, John said that maybe I would be asked what I'm working on now. And Norton Juster and I got to really know each other as we did this interview. And he is such a good storyteller and so extroverted, so eager to talk, that I felt that there was a lot more than could possibly fit into an interview. So now I'm writing the annotated Phantom Tollbooth, working very closely with him on that. Yeah. Judy Blume is someone, she's sort of an iconic figure. And I mean, the thing about her is that the humor in her books is really inextricably bound up with her courage and her eagerness to kind of question the taboos of our society, and the humor is often a way to make it acceptable, to sort of cross the boundary and in a way that readers will be able to follow. And there were some British writers and some who maybe are not quite as well known here as deserve to be, like Hilary Mackay, for instance, who has written 2 series of books about families. The more recent one starting with, well, it's the one about the Caston family. And Safi's Angel, that's right, I couldn't think of the title of the first one. They are wonderful. You know, it's a cliche to say that they're eccentric Brits, but they are. But in a really engaging way. And these kids are growing up, learning to be their own selves. You know, despite some of the problems that lots of kids face these days. You know, a family that isn't quite holding together the way it is supposed to in the ideal world. And one of the most interesting things that anyone said to me for this book, it's not comedy related per se, but she said to me that she's a mother, and she talked about how overprotected children are these days. And Michael Chabon's book of essays, which is just coming out now, is entirely about that. And she said, children's lives, by and large, are so scheduled and so unspontaneous, and in a sense, in the traditional sense, so unchildlike, that for her as a fiction writer and for many others, it's almost impossible to write a realistic story for children anymore, because there's no way that you can realistically present child characters as having enough independence to do something interesting. And she said that that's why she thinks so many writers are turning to fantasy now, because in another world, you know, children can have those adventures, but in our world, they more often than not can't.
And that's why everyone kills off the parents.
Yeah, well,
at the beginning of the,
exactly
and
right.
They're orphans.
Right,
There's a ton
right.
of
No,
orphan
no
books.
harm intended. It's really to create the premise that these children can now go off and be themselves.
Yeah.
So she has this very oddball family of artists who are so disconnected from each other that it gives her child characters the freedom to do interesting things. So that was her way of getting around it. Anyway. So, you know, there was a reason for every one of them, and I tried for variety, too, you know, different kinds of humor. More questions? Yes?
I actually have 2 questions. First of all, what is your favorite child's book, either today or from your past, for both of you?
For me, one of them would be Goodnight Moon, and it's partly because it's the ultimate in distillation of writing for a child. It's only 300 words, and it expresses, you know, a time in a child's life at the beginning of life when they need to feel like that there's a place for them in the world, in the whole scheme of things. And it does it in the simplest possible way. I mean, a 1-year-old can respond to it, either from the rhythm or from what the words are saying. And it's like music, and it sort of invites children to invent rituals that are like the ritual of the book of saying goodnight to things. So it works on all sorts of levels, and I've always admired art that just gets right to the, you know, to the core of something without fancy footwork.
Yeah, and I think one of my favorites of all time still is Goodnight, or isn't Goodnight Moon. Just like Leonard said, no. It's Go Dog Go. Because that more accurately reflected my growing up, rather than Dick and Jane. Our family was more like a bunch of different colored dogs driving around in cars and then having a party in a tree.
And then my second question was, everybody has a favorite joke. What is your favorite joke?
Oh, you better start with that. Leonard's drinking his water.
I better tell you my second favorite joke. No.
Yeah, go
I
with
don't
your
know.
second favorite
I
joke.
don't really know if I have a favorite joke. How about you, John?
Mine
let me
is
turn this over to
definitely
you.
brown and sticky.
Yeah.
Though that one works even better if you set it up with what's brown and smelly and sits in the
Yeah.
forest. Winnie the Pooh. Children's
Yeah.
related books are a book joke? No?
Well, I'm just thinking.
Oh no, John Cole's standing up now.
We have time for one more question.
John, I'm the ambassador. I can say poo, can I? Maybe not. The guy in the booth going.
Okay, well, let's have the book signing. Let's
Oh.
give applause for our...
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.